지난달 한국 외국어대학교에서 열린 제6회 Ytn 헙스 중학생 영어토론대회. 올해 이 대회에 참가하기 위해 전국에서 모인 학생 수는 무려 441명이나 된다는데, Ytn과 한국 외국어대학교가 공동으로 주최하는 이 대회는 글로벌 인재를 양성하고 학생들의 논리력을 키우기 위해 열렸습니다. 많은 학생들의 관심에 힘입어 올해로 6번째 대회가 열렸는데요. 보통의 쓰고 말하는 수준의 대회들과는 달리 제시된 주제를 놓고 찬성과 반대의 논리로 맞붙는 새로운 차원의 토론 경기가 이곳에서 펼쳐졌습니다. 이 대회는 영국식 의회 토론 방식으로 진행되는데요. 찬성팀은 수상, 부수상, 여당 원내 총무로 구성된 정부 측 역할을 맡아 찬성 의견을, 반대팀은 야당 대표, 부대표, 야당 원내 총무로 구성된 야당 측 역할을 맡아 반대 의견을 제시하게 됩니다. 이번 영어 토론 대회는 지난달 4일, 5일 양일간 예선 경기를, 6일 하루 동안은 본선 경기를 치렀는데요. 전국 중학교에서 147개의 팀이 참가해 자유롭고 활발한 경합을 벌였습니다. 토너먼트 방식으로 진행된 이 대회에서 3일간 무려 9경기를 거쳐야 결승에 진출할 수 있는데요. 과연 최종 결선은 얼마나 치열할지 벌써부터 기대가 되는데요. 지금 바로 결승 현장으로 가볼까요?
All right, welcome to the grand finals Ytn Huf's Junior Youth English Debating Championship.
본선 무대에 막이 오르고 마침내 공개된 토론 주제는 바로 정치인들은 과학 분야의 정책을 정할 때 과학자의 의견을 따라야 한다입니다. 성인에게도 결코 쉬워 보이지 않는 오늘의 토론 주제. 찬성 논거를 펼쳐야 하는 에이펙스 팀. 초등학교 동창생들이 모여 끈끈한 팀워크를 발휘해 결승까지 올라갔다는데요. 이에 맞서는 반대팀은 모더스 포네스. 토론대회 출전 경험이 많은 학생들로 구성된 실력파 팀이라는데요. 과연 어떤 경기를 펼칠지 정말 궁금해지네요. 열심히 결승전 준비를 하고 있는 찬성팀 첫 번째 주자, 대원 국제중학교 3학년 김재현 학생. 꼭 팀을 우승으로 이끌고 싶은 이유가 있다는데요.
중학교 3학년이면 내년에는 중등부 토론대회에 나가지 못하니까 마지막을 되게 유종의미를 거두고 싶었던 게 많았던 것 같아요.
정부 측 수상을 맡은 재현 학생은 정부가 이 정책을 채택해야 하는 이유를 사람들이 이해하기 쉽게 설명하는 역할입니다.
This debate is about creating a system of governance that is more practical, effective, and protect us from harm. I will show you why democracies are always limited, then show you they should be limited in the case of science, and finally present some checks and balances. And second, we will show you how this creates a more scientific society and more balanced political system. But first, let's set some parameters. Number one, Congress decides if something is a scientific question or not a scientific question. For example, a proposal to combat the climate change or the extent of pollution that we need to limit to reduce climate change. How we protect endangered animals, or simply the exact number of bald eagles we need to protect. Number two, the scientific question will be passed to a committee comprising of experts recognized by the scientific community, those with the most number of peer-reviewed journals and biggest accomplishments in the field of science. These experts must formulate a decision and publish their full findings, data, agreements, and disagreements, much like the Supreme Court does now. Unlike the Supreme Court, however, they will have fixed terms, maybe 3 to 5 years. Under our model, politicians have no choice but to pass the question to the scientific committee. In the status quo, politicians can ignore this advice. Our model gives a clear and powerful voice of science and brings more balance. So let me go on and answer the first question. Why, in principle, democracies are always limited? This is an extension of democratic checks and balances. Realize that there is no such thing as an absolute democracy. This is because, in reality, a democracy is a system designed to maximize efficiency and utility for the people. There is no such thing as an absolute democracy, only a functional or dysfunctional democracy. A functional democracy realizes that sometimes experts need to make decisions protected from populism, that are not reactionary, that are long-term. That's why we trust learned and experienced Supreme Court judges to decide if laws are constitutional or not, or during times of war, we trust the decorated military officers to act on our behalf. We argue that same parallels exist with science. So let me go on and answer the second question, why science? Number one, science is incredibly complex. Most people don't even know how telephone technology works, let alone understand something as complex as the Earth's climate system. When your TV doesn't work, you hit it. So when deciding the best policy to ensure that climate change doesn't lead to sinking countries, droughts that will starve us to global epidemics, should we trust the politicians or should we trust the experts? Politicians elected by the people are rarely, if ever, voted for their understanding of science. In the American House of Representatives, out of 435 people, there is only one physicist, one chemist, and one microbiologist. In contrast, 168 of them have law degrees. During political debates, for the president of governors, moderators will ask questions about business, military strategy, law, but never science. The result is, these politicians are easily manipulated by lobby groups or companies who tell them climate change is a hoax and vaccinations give you cancer, and they will believe it. Number two, science is very powerful. The greatest challenge to our humanity isn't just war or global terrorism, it's climate change, or an asteroid attack, or mega volcanic eruption that blacks out the sun. Darkness for a few weeks might be enough to drastically affect food production, crashing economies and starving millions, if not billions of people. Additional 150,000 people die every year right now because of climate change. And what are politicians doing? Earlier this year, Senator Jim Inhofe brought a snowball into the American Senate on an unusually cold day to show that climate change wasn't real. That's like saying because you have food, starvation isn't real. Science is objective and peer-reviewed, and scientists will want to protect their reputation. Science always has peer review processes. If the committee suggests something improbable, hundreds of other scientists can disprove their facts. Of course, scientists debate and have discourse. But if there is sufficient certainty that they are not wrong, the committee should proceed. This is better than in the status quo, where politicians do not work on evidence and there is no peer review process. Furthermore, scientists know that in order for their policies to be accepted, they need to be applicable and supported. They will not blindly propose ridiculous, impossible policies that will destroy the country just because they are crazy with power. If all they wanted was power, then they would just become politicians, right? Finally, scientists are very transparent and have reputations to protect. They have 20 or 30 years of publications, research, teaching, and their main focus is science. Once they leave the committee, they want to become a trusted scientist again, and so will not destroy their scientific reputation. That's why we are more than proud to propose.
수상 역할의 재현 학생은 기후변화처럼 중대한 과학 이슈가 의회에서는 잘 다루어지지 않는 문제점을 꼬집었습니다. 그 대안으로 과학을 중시하는 정치 체계를 세우자는 건데요. 이야, 재현 학생을 국회로 보내도 되겠어요? 정부 측 수상이 발표한 탄탄한 정책을 반박할 자는 과연 누구일 소냐? 대망의 첫 주자는 바로 서울국제학교 9학년 최누리 학생. 누리 학생에게도 팀을 꼭 승리로 이끌어야 할 물러설 수 없는 이유가 있다고 합니다.
전 대회를 3년 동안 해봤는데 올해 처음으로 결승까지 오게 되니까 중3 나이니까 그것도 좀 중요하다는 느낌이 들고요. 마지막 기회니까 좀 열심히 하고 싶다는 생각도 많이 드네요.
2년 전 처음 출전한 Ytn 영어토론대회. 본선에조차 오르지 못했는데요. 실망하지 않고 다시 도전한 작년. 결국 본선 16강에 진출했고 탑 스피커상까지 받았습니다. 그리고 올해 부단한 노력이 누리 학생을 이 자리에 서게 만들었습니다. 야당 측 대표 역을 맡은 누리 학생은 정부가 이 정책을 채택하면 안 되는 이유를 사람들이 쉽게 이해하게끔 설명하는 역할입니다.
Proposition today needed to prove to you why science was so great to outdo government in an issue of policymaking, but also why science could overarch the rules of a democratic government and take its duty instead. They still have yet to do either. We will prove to you why both contentions of these from the proposition are wrong under 4 arguments on democracy, political and scientific harms, natural change, and the role of politics. Before we move on to my arguments, let's take a look at some rebuttals. So let's look at the policy they created, first of all. We agree with the fact that maybe in this case, science, once again, is an important problem in our society. But when we look at their policy, first of all, we think there's a major problem in that Congress, first of all, has no incentive to give up these laws for scientists. When you look at the fact that Congress is going to be losing its duty in this case, as we told you before, we think that government has no incentive, first of all, to pass on these bills. But additionally, they also talk about how scientific advice will be drowned out. But we say that this is a natural part of democracy. If politicians feel that people's interests are leaning towards science, or if people's interests are leaning towards corporate ideas, they can make the decisions for themselves. It is their job to do this. Proposition has to prove to you why scientific duties, why politicians' duties can simply come before certain fears. We said these certain fears are going to be addressed even in our status quo. That's what I'm going to deal with. Let's move on to the second argument.
Sir.
No, thank you. They said that science is extremely complex. We agree, but that's only if you're going to be a microbiologist. We think you don't have to be a microbiologist to understand that global warming is certain, or that it's something that happens. We think the issue isn't that these people can never comprehend these ideas. The issue is that there is a lack of education and removing this misinformation in the status quo.
Sir.
Yeah?
We think this size-specific numbers of the policies or the clauses of policies expertise is needed, and politicians have no incentive to consider this in the status quo.
We actually think that politicians feel that these scientific advisors' needs are enough. They have the incentive to consider this, because these people aren't just doing this because they feel like, oh, money, money, money. These people are politicians, and as much as some people hate them, there are certain cases where they have to judge for society. Is this going to be better for society, or is it going to be this, science or economy? And we think they can make the judgments. Unless you're going to claim that every politician does not have the abilities they have, we think this is not the case in today's debate. Let's move on to finally the third argument before I move on to my arguments. We see that, first of all, when they talk about cases where politicians have no incentive, that's not the case. Just recently, John Kerry gave a pro-recognizing climate change speech at the Atlanta Council. People can do this, and politicians do understand the need for science. We think there is a balance in Senate Hall as well. But then they say that scientists have no incentive to abuse because of their reputation. Not true. When you look at recently, scientist Hwang Won-seok, he put his reputation on the line for something that he thought would benefit him. For example, publishing another paper. We think these cases just show that scientists are willing to risk their reputations when a greater benefit they foresee is on the way. But additionally, on to my second argument about the harm to science and policies. Policies without democratic support have not worked, and it's the same here. If these people do not feel that these policies represent them, to force this change will only cause harm. When a quarter of Americans don't believe in climate change, which is sad, but regardless, this policy will be met with opposition by millions of Americans. We think the more important issue is educating them. Take a look at the recent legalization of gay marriage. Here, the Supreme Court's mistake, which was a decision, albeit supported by many, was opposed to many other right-wing Americans who even began to vehemently discriminate homosexuals even more. We think that education was something that should have come first. And that's the problem with their policy, that it only puts shoving scientists in our policies first, regardless of whether these citizens really want these interests or not. Unless there's natural change, it will never work. Speaking of which, natural change is my final argument. And this is why change has come from the people as well. We think that unless change comes from the bottom up, it is not truly effective change. People who protest for their rights, for example, are a lot more better off than people who expect the government to do things for them. Similarly, when scientists connect with their people, they're a lot more successful. Take a look at, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking. We also feel that more and more science is already being input in our lives than ever, and people are nursing a small but growing interest in it. This policy, however, will only worsen this image by presenting a high-notch, elitist barrier that has just been overcome by the people we mentioned. By discouraging people from the sciences, we lose people's interest in scientific policymaking, but also any form of trying to understand what scientists may be trying to explain to the public. We think that at the end of the day, because they lose people's interest, because they lose the idea of democracy, their policies have no place in government. For all these reasons, we oppose.
야당 대표역의 누리 학생은 과학 전문가 집단을 내세우며 오히려 국민과 의회 사이에 장벽이 생길 수 있다는 점을 지적했네요. 이런 논리라면 정부 측도 꽤나 골치가 아프겠어요. 괜찮을까요? 어깨가 무거울 것 같은 다음 주자는 정부 측 부수상역을 맡은 숙명여자중학교 3학년 신보미 학생. 승리하고 싶은 마음도 크지만 이 대회에 바라는 점이 하나 더 있다는데요.
오늘 결승까지 온 만큼 사실 절대로 지고 싶지 않고 열심히 해서 그쪽 팀이랑 우리 팀 둘 다 좋은 디베이트를 했었으면 좋겠습니다.
정부 측 부수상역의 보미 학생은 상대 팀을 반박하는 동시에 우리 팀을 대변하는 막중한 임무의 두 번째 주자입니다.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that there are unique qualities of science. We think that science is more objective and more powerful than any other areas that exist inside politics. We say that in this case, scientific committees should and can be a checks and balance mechanisms inside democracy that is never perfect in the status quo. So, Mr. and Madam Speaker, today's debate was about evaluating the degree of harms and benefits, whose policy is much more objective. We agree to the fact that science can never be always objective, and always be the standard. But Mr. Madam Speaker, when politicians are the worst actors of doing this, like we explained in our argument, we should incorporate scientific and scientists' opinion into law as well, because that can only happen under our paradigm, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why we take today's debate home. Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that people are rational. We believe people to be rational. That's why when politicians and scientists also collaborate and make out this kind of policies that protect our environment, they're going to accept these kind of policies because they know that the environment is a standard and is something that's important for our society as well. It's just that they can't do it on their own. This means that when scientists bring out policies that are beneficial to the environment, people are rational enough to accept these kind of policies, and that's why public support wasn't a big matter in today's debate. And thirdly, Mr. Madam Speaker, these approaches should sometimes be top to bottom, because we told you that climate change and environmental issues are extremely unique. That's because people feel detached to these kind of issues. The effects of climate change doesn't happen in developed countries, it happens in developing countries. That's why people doesn't get the seriousness of climate change in the status quo. That's why they can't voluntarily make changes. In this case, government has the obligation to make changes for the people so that this can change people's perception. And this is the policy that we support in today's debate, Mr. Madam Speaker, because politicians aren't the best actor in this case. And secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, that's why their point about education doesn't also stand as well. Because firstly, we think that this education is not mutually exclusive to begin with. We think that education can be also done in our policy as well, but the problem is that it takes time. And we told you that this is an imminent matter, that climate change is affecting people's lives, it's killing people, Mr. Madam Speaker. People are being sacrificed. When this is an imminent matter, we can't take time educating these people, then carry out these policies. Secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we already told you how it's not the matter of accurate information, it's not the matter of education, it's the matter of detachment. We told you that because the effects of climate change are subtle and long-term, it's really hard for people to get this kind of changes, and that's why scientists are really needed in these kind of issues as well. And lastly, Mr. Madam Speaker, they told us the politicians will never pass this kind of bills upon this kind of scientists, and that's a problem. And they told us that scientific issues are not confined to scientific issues. But firstly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we told you in our model that we're going to pass away questions that are objective. For example, when we want to carry out policies that put cap on carbon emissions on corporation, we're going to ask how much carbon emission is adequate amount for this corporation to and what kind of effect this gives to the environment itself. So we think that there are objectivity in terms of science. And secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, if they're talking about controversial issues that both have strong opposing parties and supporting parties, Mr. Madam Speaker, in this case, government should not prioritize subjective values like morality or economy or things that many people disagree upon. In this case, we should take into consideration the most objective standard, which is science, and that's what the value that we promote in today's debate. We think that science is objective and can be objective, and because this debate is comparative, Mr. Madam Speaker, and that's what we took these points home. Having said that, let's go on to our last argument, which is about we can improve the overall effectiveness of the democratic system in the long term, because we think that the democratic system already has too much on their hands. Because the Congress came to close last year, they saw that 6,845 bills were introduced, but they only passed 500 bills among these. Bills are also 100 pages long, and that takes years for physical people to understand this kind of policies anyway. So if these kind of burdens are removed, it frees the congressmen to focus on other things that are about opinions and society and depend on what people think. And we think that this is the role of politicians that we support in today's democracy. It also allows politicians to deflect scientific issues to scientists. Right now, lobbyists and companies are pressured them to do what's good for business only, but we can block that in the status quo by having checks and balance mechanism, by promoting what's objective, promoting what's for the people in the long term, because we can actually prevent this kind of environmental harm, and that's why we take today's debate home.
정부 부수상 역을 맡은 보미 학생은 국민이 중요한 문제에 관심이 없을 땐 위에서 아래로의 접근도 필요하다고 주장했습니다. 바람직한 방향으로 국민들을 선도하는 것 또한 정부의 의무라는 것이 그 근거였는데요. 듣고 보니 보미 학생의 말도 맞는 것 같네요. 점점 결과를 예측하기 어려운 오늘의 토론. 여기서 더 이상 반박할 내용이 있을까요? 그런데 상황을 아는지 모르는지 마냥 해맑은 얼굴로 웃고 있는 이 학생은 누구? 바로 반대팀의 두 번째 주자인 대청중학교 3학년 김민영 학생.
일단 지금 결승까지 오게 된 것에 대해서 매우 기쁘고요. 그다음에 저번에는 결승까지 왔는데도 아쉽게도 우승을 하지 못해서 이번에는 꼭 한번 우승을 해보고 중학교 생활을 마치고 싶습니다.
아하, 역시 결승에 진출해봐서 이렇게 침착할 수 있었던 거군요. 작년엔 아쉽게도 준우승에 그쳐 많이 속상했던 모양인데요. 얼마나 발전했을지 한번 지켜볼까요? 야당 부대표 역을 맡은 민영 학생은 정부 측이 반박한 야당 측의 논리를 보강해 다시 한번 입장을 확고히 해야 합니다.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, what we have on Team Proposition is a pool of scientists who are going to be able to dictate on how government policies are enforced, because the final call is upon the proposition is given to scientists, and without no other checks and balance to checks and balance these scientists' power, Mr. and Madam Speaker. And we think that because there is no checks and balance between these kind of powers, we think that scientists have an incentive to abuse their powers that they have. But what do we have under opposition's case? We think that in opposition's case, like every other field does, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we have advisors that can advise politicians upon the scientific facts that they know upon. We think that politicians are incentivized to follow these kind of policies because they are incentivized to go for re-election, which needs to be accepted by the public. So if public does accept of certain concepts of science, the politicians are naturally going to be incentivized to propose such kind of policies in the first place. But we think that we also suggested to you that organic change is happening in the status quo. We think that the problem is recognized. We think that when problems are solved, it goes to the process of where, first of all, the problem is recognized, then it goes to how they persuade the public, and then policies are made. But we think that having that said, before going on to our team's argument, which is going to be about how this will taint science and make science political, let me rebut to the previous speaker. So first of all, he talked about how their premise was that accepting science will automatically lead to individual benefit. It is objective scientific fact that getting vaccination will lead to lesser possibilities of you getting disease. So scientifically, this is good for individuals. But individually speaking, we think that there are families who believe that getting vaccinations will lead to their children being dumber. We think that in this cases, we think that these individual benefits are not achieved by protecting the scientific values. Also, when they say that politicians are the worst actor to decide upon such scientific issues, we think that they're trusting the worst actors of science then to decide on what is scientific question or not, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We think that when that is the case, and when that is the characterization of what government gives to us, then how can we trust these politicians to give out these scientific questions to scientific committees in the first place? Also, we think that when they say that politicians are rational to a point where they will accept these kind of policies when these are upon these kind of scientific committees, we think that lobbying groups like Shell, like oil companies, would lobby more to politicians in order to not let the matter pass to the scientific committee. And since corporations would now hold politicians accountable for letting the matter go to the scientific council, we think that it is not going to be different from the status quo. But the extra harm of government policy is that politicians will try to detach themselves from the scientific committee, because if the decision that scientific committee made is going to fail, the politicians are going to be held accountable if they also propose policies that support the scientific committee's decision. And that's the reason why I think that there is an incentive for these kind of scientific politicians to not follow the decisions that are made by the scientific committees, and therefore there are not going to be extra law enforcement that are from these kind of scientific committees' decisions. But secondly, when it comes to scientific committees that they propose, there is nobody to checks and balance the decisions that the scientific committee makes, because the final call will be upon these kind of scientific committees. And we think that because there is these kind of issues, and because scientists are also human, we think that there will be issues such as corruption. We think that corruption is also more prevalent in the case that these scientists are getting the research funds from certain corporations. We think that because scientists also need money from these corporations to continue on with the researches, we think that corruption is going to be a big problem that is within the scientists, because at least the politicians are held accountable when they are found being lobbied by certain groups. We think that these scientists are not held accountable under government's policy. So we think that that's why their policy is actually worse, considering the characterizations that they gave us. So going on to our team's argument, which is about how this will help taint science and make science political, we think that Daniel S. Greenberg, the author of 2001 book, Science, Money, and Politics, we think that they argue that there is widespread belief that political involvement is inappropriate for serious researches and taints their objectivity. He pointed to the American presidential election of 1964, where scientists organized opposition opposition to Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate. And Goldwater was defeated, but Mr. Greenberg also said that the effort made left many researchers feeling that we have sullied science. We think that people who don't understand science, and these are the people that the government team says are the majority, will not trust scientists and will believe that they're just doing what they politically want. We think that some commenter on Fox will say that they are all liberal stooges, and they will all agree with Fox. We think that this makes it harder for them to trust any and all science in the future, and leading to more harms, like not believing in vaccinations, or like not listening to your doctor when they ask you not to travel because maybe you have a contagious disease like MERS. We think that this harms the organic change that can happen and is happening in society today. We think that because these scientists are also not gods, they can be corrupted. And we think that science is very powerful precisely because it is objective and neutral. And the best thing for society is for scientists to stay that way. Thank you.
야당 부대표역의 민영 학생은 국민들의 지지가 없는 정책은 실행되어선 안 된다며 정부 측을 반박했습니다. 또한 과학자들이 최종 결정 권한을 가지면 부패할 가능성이 있다는 점을 짚어냈군요. 1년 동안 별 본 게 많네요. 맞아. 날카로운 반박에 맞서야 하는 다음 주자는 누구? 대원국제중학교 3학년 구윤찬 학생. 번번이 준결승에서 떨어지던 징크스를 깨고 처음으로 당당히 결승전에 진출했다는데요.
저는 사실 디베이트를 초등학교 때부터 했는데 막 예선 탈락도 해보고 뭐 결승에서 져보기도 하고 해서 특히 Ytn 영어토론대회에서는 항상 준결승에서 져서 결승 바로 올라가기 전에 져서 되게 많은 실패 경험이 있었는데 좋은 팀메이트들과 함께 하니까 같이 시너지 효과도 나고 훨씬 더 재미있게 디베이트할 수 있었던 것 같아요.
여당 측 원내 총무역의 윤찬 학생은 정부가 찬성하는 이 정책이 실질적으로 국민들에게 어떠한 영향을 미치는지를 피부에 와닿게 말해야 합니다.
So, Madam Mrs. Speaker, the first thing we told you from side proposition is that we are in an imminent danger, that there is a threat, that environmental problems are killing more than 15,000 million people a year, and we think this is a problem we need to solve. The status quo that opposition is suggesting to us is ignorant to those problems, and education policies we have in school already exist, but this proves that already in status quo this exists, but the problem is continuing. So we think that the problem that they want to solve will never be solved under their model, and we think that therefore we have better solvency, and that's why we're very proud to propose. Let's directly move on to the first clash, as her arguments will be rebutted in my third clash. Are politicians the rightful actors, or is it the scientists? We thought that both sides agreed that scientific issues are important, that environment issues are on a threat, and this debate ultimately boiled down to that in these issues, who should be the rightful actors to decide. Now, let's first look at the politicians that they suggest. They told you that politicians have an incentive to consider science even under their model. That was what their leader of opposition told you. Firstly, we think that that's a major concession that politics need to take into account of science. Because if they say that that is a benefit, that politicians are already taking into account of science, that proves the importance of necessity of our policy. But secondly, we think that politicians have less incentive to consider science because of a number of reasons. Firstly, they have an incentive of re-election. They want to get re-elected. And they have conceded that people in the current status quo are ignorant about science issues. That's why we need to educate them, right? And we think that if that's the case, because of the incentive of re-election, politicians have no incentive to put environmental issues into the political agenda to begin with, have no incentive to send policies about environmental issues, and we think that that is a harm. But thirdly, we think that it is empirically untrue that politicians are considering environment right now in status quo. We gave you the example of Clean Air Act, where it was only 50 years ago, there was a last decision, last law that the US government made about the environment. And this proves a lack of discussion about environment right now in status quo. And when opposition conceded with the severeness of status quo, we think that that's quite problematic. But furthermore, they told you that because there are advisors right now in status quo, like their policy would be perfect, right? But we clearly told you under our model that we would also have advisors that inform people about economy, inform people about society. This debate is what to prioritize. And our deputy clearly told you that in the matter of decision, in the matter of prioritization, hard facts, no thank you sir, should be the standard of deciding, not subjective values. And we think that that is the way to gain better acceptance in society, and that is the way to go. Yes, madam?
Don't you think that scientists can also become a corrupt party?
I'm going to rebut that in my second part of the clash. So let's move on to secondly, the scientists, right? And they told you that under our model, we wouldn't even give issues to scientists, and that is quite problematic. We don't think that would be likely under our model, because firstly, when it is evidently a scientific issue and Parliament disagrees and refuses to give these issues to environmental issues, that's much more apparent under our model. When science committee doesn't even get a single issue to make decisions upon, that's quite more apparent, and that leads to better natural checks and balances. But secondly, we think that these scientists have less lobbyist influences, because compared to political campaigns, and these people need political campaigns, they need funding to get political campaigns. And we think that that is the unique characteristic of these politicians. But in these scientists, they also need to protect the reputation of themselves as a scientist. When they start distorting facts, the science community is going to start criticizing them. They're going to be prevented from getting Nobel Prizes. While the incentive of politicians only remain to get support of citizens, scientists have an incentive to get the support of other experts who know about the scientific issues, and therefore we think that they have a better incentive to less be corrupted. But furthermore, they told you scientists are not a good actor because we can't hold politicians accountable when scientists make decisions. Yes, but we can hold scientists accountable because they will be shown on media, they will be criticized from society when they make radical decisions, so we think that we can hold scientists accountable under our model. Then let's move on to the second clash in this debate. What is the government obligated to do? So they told you that always the government should support for bottom-top approaches, and therefore education is the way to go. Firstly, no, we think that the government has an obligation to look in the long run and also implement philanthropic perspectives of policies. That's why they conceded that the government shouldn't leave society alone. They should have initiatives to change the perception of people. That itself proves that the government has an obligation to change citizens and to look in the more long run. And we think that government policies can change perception of people. That is why in Constitution, even though majority support is gathered in Parliament, we think that in the Supreme Court judges, we restrict that for better good. We veto that for better good, and we think that that is the way to go. That the government shouldn't just leave society and make it collapse. We think that the government has an obligation to restrict foreseeable harms from happening. But secondly, we told you imminence of situation, that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the environment problems are going to be aggravated. Under that case, we think that educational policies have existed for decades, so it's a gradual process that's too slow. We think that we need to take an action and then make people informed about that and then change societal perceptions. Doing nothing and saying that we're going to educate you is too much of an irresponsible stance. Moving on to the third clash, trust towards science. Now, they told you in their last argument that our policy will lower the trust towards science. We have two responses. Firstly, we think that it will actually work the opposite, because people will now see that, hey, these sciences actually contributed, is actually relevant with the legislations that influence my life. Therefore, they feel less detachment from scientific issues under our model because they visually see that these science committees can make decisions that impact my life. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, we emphasize the imminence of situation, that people try to detach themselves from science. If that's the case, we think that we need a strong initiative, we need a strong urgent policy to solve and deal with the imminent problem we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
여당 원내 총무역의 윤찬 학생은 과학은 그 특성상 부패할 가능성이 낮다며 야당 부대표의 주장을 받아쳤는데요. 이어서 환경 문제처럼 시급한 사안에 대해선 정부가 신속하고 강력하게 정책을 시행해야 한다고 쐐기를 박았네요. 한편 지금까지의 모든 논거들 중에서 중요한 대립을 골라내야 하는 역할의 세 번째 주자는 야당 원내 총무역을 맡은 서울국제학교 9학년 김희원 학생.
디베이트를 다시 시작하면서 진짜 내가 디베이트를 좋아한다 그런 생각이 들었는데 대회 많이 나가면서도 그렇게 뭐 결과는 그렇게 좋지 않은 것 같아서 노력에 비해서 진짜 많이 속상해했는데 정말 이번에 한번 꼭 이겨서 그 안타까움과 그런 후회들을 풀고 싶고 진짜 정말 디베이트가 저한테 얼마나 소중한 건지 알게 되었습니다.
토론 없인 못 산다는 희원 학생. 희원 학생이 맡은 원내 총무는 영어로 whip, 즉 채찍이란 뜻인데요. 채찍질 같은 발언으로 상대팀의 정신을 번쩍 들게 해줄 수 있을까요?
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that there are two main issues in today's debate. Firstly, we think that there is no justification for Proposition Side's policy, but secondly, we think that Proposition's model is not effective in the first place, even if we assume that their policy does have justification. So firstly, let's address why their policy doesn't have justification. We think firstly that the Proposition Side is saying that the politicians are A, corrupt or prone to corruption or lobbyists, and B, that they have a lack of knowledge in science. We think firstly on point A that all parts of political processes need to be considered in a democracy. And we think that lobbyists, as well as corruption, is a part of democracy. It is a part of political processes. It's not something we can cut out from this political process. It is something that is part of the nature of our democracies and the nature of these political processes. But also, we think that scientists are also prone to corruption. We think that the only thing that Proposition Side is trusting is that these scientists have a conscience to not be subjective, and that they're going to be purely objective because the nature of science is so objective. Now, additionally, we think that the nature of Congress, right, is that there is corruption, and we think that that is going to apply regardless of whether we have this scientific committee or not. We think that that's still going to be there, and that Proposition Side has failed to prove to us why scientists, just because the nature of science itself is objective, are not going to be swayed by their personal causes, by their personal scientific career, and by their own conscience. After all, these people are humans. These people are human beings, and they can be swayed. They can become corrupt. Now, let's think about the second clash, right? So then, why was Proposition's model not effective, even if we assume that there is justification? No, thank you, sir. We think that firstly, like they said, democracy can't be perfect, right? And we think that science, just because they justified it as a unique field, does not deserve to have this special attention. Just because science, as well as this kinds of climate change and environmental problems or other problems that are connected with the field of science is so dire, does not mean that we have to suddenly make a scientific committee only for these scientific problems when we see that economy, law, all these other fields and subjects in politics are just as important. We think that another important part is that socioeconomic aspects are ignored under the Proposition Side's policy. These scientists are not policymakers. They are not politicians. They are not people who have been part of government and been making policies for the citizens' interests, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think they're going to be able to know how to make a policy. They're going to make a research journal. They're going to make a science journal, and we don't think we need that in today's status quo. We think that's not going to be effective. That's not going to help us solve the scientific problems. So how will we solve these scientific problems? We on Opposition Side told you that we are going to change the public first. We think that organic and natural change is the only way to solve these problems. Just as Proposition said, these people can't feel the direct effects, right? They can't feel what are the effects of these environmental problems? How exactly is this problem so dire and so urgent? Well, we think that Proposition Side's policy only exacerbates those harms. We decrease the incentives for these citizens to increase their environmental awareness and try to find out more about these environmental problems. We think that instead, their perception of science grows more and more distant, and they start pushing it more and more to the side and away from them. They start thinking that science is some complicated field that requires a high level of knowledge and a high level of time that they need to devote, and they don't think that they're going to be able to understand science. And so we think that we need to get these people to understand science. We need to get them to see the effects, the dire consequences of these environmental problems and scientific problems, and then we need to start implementing these policies. We can't just force these policies on these citizens who don't understand why there are environmental problems that are so serious in the first place. When the citizens look at Proposition's policy, they're not going to understand why they're being forced to follow these policies. They're not going to understand what these scientific committees are publishing as to the justifications of why these policies need to be followed. They're not going to understand any of this jargon or scientific knowledge. And so we think that this is going to only cause them to fear science, that they're going to back away from trying to increase their environmental awareness. We think that if you're going to cause a change, you can't force it down the throats of your citizens. You're going to need to take responsibility as a government, and you're going to have to change the public's opinion first. We are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
야당 원내 총무역의 희원 학생은 과학의 특성이 객관적이라고 해서 과학자들이 부패를 저지르지 않는다는 말은 결코 옳지 않다고 정면으로 반박했습니다. 과학자와 정치인의 역할과 책임이 엄연히 다르다는 점도 강조했네요. 후회 없는 토론을 하고 싶다더니 오늘 밤에 정말 두 다리 쭉 뻗고 잘 수 있겠어요? 지금까지 나온 야당 측의 입장을 정리해볼까요? 첫째, 과학자들의 힘만 키운다면 국민들이 원하는 바는 무시한 일방적인 정책이 된다. 둘째, 과학위원회와 기업이 결탁해 부패를 저지를 수도 있다. 따라서 과학만 특별하게 취급할 이유가 없으며 정부는 시간을 두고 국민들의 공감을 이끌어내야 한다. 하하, 야당의 논리가 만만치 않습니다. 하지만 이게 끝이 아니라는 것. 민영 학생에겐 한 번 더 역할이 주어졌는데요. 각 팀을 대표하는 주자 한 명이 나와 자신의 팀에게 유리한 발언을 할 수 있는 마지막 기회가 있다고 합니다. 이번엔 반대팀이 먼저 최종 발언을 하게 됩니다. 기회는 오직 3분. 팀의 승리를 이끌기 위한 절호의 찬스. 민영 학생은 이 마지막 기회를 잡을 수 있을까요?
Mr. Madam Speaker, if team proposition really values effectiveness and really wants to solve climate change like really in a fast time, maybe they should choose dictatorship because that's the most easy way that you can solve climate change because all you have to do is order to the citizens, don't do this, and we will put on regulations. But the reason why we think that they are not doing this and they're trying to take a more subtle version of dictatorship by making a scientific committee is because proposition also agrees to some point to the concept of democracy. Because we think that in democracy, effectiveness is not the core issue. We think that the core issue is about the citizens' opinions. Democracy is all about accepting the citizens' opinions. And that's why we explain to you, when a change happens, it must happen in the process of first persuading the citizens first, and then a policy change happening. And that's the reason as we gave you for democracy. This was never engaged upon by the proposition side until this point. But having that said, let me move on to explaining some harms and benefits that both government and opposition pointed out. The first harm of government side or benefit is that they will be able to solve climate change. First of all, that's not going to happen. First of all, we told you that these politicians have no incentive to send the matter to the scientific committee in the first place due to the lobbying and like such problems that the proposition side has identified. And this point was never engaged upon by the proposition, which means that their policy also has no solvency. But secondly, we think that the change will not be supported by additional policies which need to be done in order to solve the climate change itself. We think that politicians, because they want to be detached from the failure of scientific committees, because they want to win votes, they will be trying to detach themselves from these kind of actions done by scientific committees. Therefore, the decisions will not be supported. But secondly, the citizens, because they had no say over the decisions that scientific committee made, they are not going to support the policies either. So we think that in order for a policy to be successful, it not only doesn't need the policies, it also needs citizens and politicians' support from the back. We don't think that their policy does the second one. We think that also we are seeing progress in the status quo. The public's view is actually changing, Mr. Madam Speaker. We see the U.S. and China also engaged in like treaties, such as like they did in the last year's treaty to decrease in their carbon emissions, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that these are things that are actually happening, and organic change is happening. They're the ones who harm organic change. But secondly, about how they're going to feel attached more to science and going to engage with in my opposition's harms. But the harms that opposition gave you was really, really tangible and clear. But secondly, we also told you about the harm of how it taints science. First of all, because these people feel detached and they feel that science is something that can only be accessed by the elitists of the society, which are the scientists. Because they're sending out the message that even politicians cannot understand science, this is going to be a problem. But secondly, they're going to feel that science is politicized. Thirdly, we also told you about how this hinders organic change. All points of the opposition side was never engaged upon by the proposition. So we think that opposition wins this debate.
야당 최종 변론자 역할을 맡은 민영 학생은 민주적 절차에 따라 국민들의 동의를 충분히 구하지 않는다면 이 정책을 시행해선 안 된다는 점을 재차 강조했습니다. 그럼 찬성팀의 입장은 어떠했는지 정리해볼까요? 첫째, 정치인과 과학 전문가가 협력하면 객관적이고 균형 잡힌 정책을 만들 수 있다. 둘째, 기후변화처럼 시급한 문제에서는 전문가들의 도움을 받아 적극적으로 정책을 추진해야 한다. 따라서 과학 전문가들을 따른다면 효율적이고 기능적인 정책을 만들 수 있다. 아유 참, 누구의 손을 들어줘야 할지 심판들도 참 막막하겠어요. 활용 점정을 찍어줄 정부 측 최종 변론자 신보미 학생이 맡게 되었네요. 찬성팀에게도 똑같이 3분의 시간이 주어집니다. 보미 학생은 3분이라는 짧은 시간 동안 어떻게 심판들의 마음을 사로잡을 수 있을까요?
Mr. Madam Speaker, the only line of logic coming from the opposition side in today's debate was that we have to change public's opinion first. But Mr. Madam Speaker, they agreed to the fact that public feel detachment towards the issue, and that's why they're going to be angry when scientists make this kind of policies. We think problems are imminent. Climate change is influencing our lives really fast, and in this case scenario, Mr. Madam Speaker, scientists should be the one who make the final call in this case. Having said so, let's go on and identify the two main issues in today's debate. firstly, this characterization of scientists and scientific issues. So firstly, they mentioned something about corruption and lobbying. But Mr. Madam Speaker, we already told you that it's a matter of degree, that when there's an imminent difference between politicians and scientists, where politicians have much stronger incentive to actually have this kind of issues because they want to be re-elected, and that's why they're more likely to be corrupt than scientists who focus on fame and reputation, Mr. Madam Speaker. This point was never engaged. And secondly, they told us why are scientific matters always objective, and they gave us examples of vaccination. We already told you that in terms of controversial issues like vaccination, government should consider what's objective, and that's science. We already told you that was also not responded. And thirdly, we gave you why scientists are accountable and why there are checks and balance mechanisms. We gave you in our argument from the first moment when our Prime Minister came and told you about these things. We gave example of peer review and how this kind of policies needs to be accepted by people. And thirdly, that these people need to gain a reputation in scientific field, and their opposition whip comes and engage on this point. And until that point, no one engaged to this point about checks and balance, and that's why we took this kind of clash home. And secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, whose policy is better for the people in the long term? So firstly, they talked about how we need citizen support. Well, they showed a really inconsistent stance coming from this about citizen support, because they told us that people doesn't know the imminent problems of climate change, and that's why people are going to be angry. And then they tell us that it's changing, so it's fine, Mr. Madam Speaker. So we didn't get what kind of clear stance was coming from their side. But thirdly, we told you that sometimes there needs to be not a bottom-up approach, but top-bottom approach, because that's the role of government, to change the perception inside of society to make it more positive. That was the role of government. And secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, they told us about advisor. When they concede that advisor are effective, we already told you that under our paradigm, we're also going to have advisor who advise this kind of scientists on political issues. So it's fine when we have advisor, right? And lastly, they come and talk about education. We told you why unique benefit exists only under our paradigm and under our policy, because education takes extremely long time. And when we already told you that climate change and environmental problems are extremely imminent and it needs to be engaged with immediately, Mr. Madam Speaker, they're the ones who can't change this, and they're going to wait until the public all agrees to that. And we think that that's never going to happen, and that's why they can never solve this kind of issues, and that's why we take today's debate home.
정부 측 최종 변론자 역할의 보미 학생은 정책 수립 과정에서 견제와 균형의 원칙을 지키고 시급한 환경 문제를 해결하기 위해선 과학 전문가를 활용하는 것이 최선의 방법이라는 근거로 이번 정책에 힘을 실어주었습니다. 효율적인 정치 체계를 만들기 위해 과학 전문가의 의견을 수렴해야 한다는 찬성팀. 과학 전문가가 정치인의 역할을 대신할 수 없다는 반대팀. 6명의 학생들이 팽팽한 격전 속에서 토론 대회가 끝이 났습니다. 이제 심판의 채점 결과만을 남겨놓고 있는데요. 토론을 무사히 마친 두 팀은 지금 어떤 심정일까요?
저희라면 뭐 처음부터 잘한 것 같고요. 우승 상관없이 이겼든 2등했든 먼저 최선을 다한 것 같아서 그게 더 중요한 것 같다고 생각해요.
끝나서 우선 후련하고 좀 제대로 잘 소화하지 못한 부분도 있어서 아쉬운 점도 남지만 그래도 재밌었던 디베이트였던 것 같아요.
마침내 시작된 시상식. 올해는 유독 중학생 참가자 수가 많았던 만큼 수상팀 수를 늘렸는데요. 이번 대회는 참가한 147개 팀 중 본선에 진출한 32개 팀, 탑 스피커 10명 등 총 58개 부문을 시상했습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 남은 오늘의 하이라이트. 두 손을 꼭 모아쥔 채 대망의 우승팀 발표를 기다리고 있는 찬성 측의 에이펙스 팀, 반대 측의 모더스포넨스 팀. 긴장은 고조되고
The champion of the 6th Ytn Hobbs Ytn Junior Youth English Debating Championship. With a unanimous decision, the champion goes to Team Apex.
입이 떡하고 벌어진 아이들. 놀란 와중에도 상대팀에 대한 격려를 잊지 않네요. 시상을 준비하면서도 도무지 팀의 우승이 믿겨지지 않는 듯 얼떨떨한 모습인데요. 모두의 힘찬 축하와 격려의 박수 속에서 우승을 한 에이펙스 팀과 준우승을 한 모더스포넨스 팀은 상장과 트로피, 상금을 수상했습니다.
진짜 예상하지 못했는데 갑자기 이렇게 돼서 저도 사실 어떻게 된 건지 잘 모르겠어요.
저도 막 되게 불안하고 막 이기면 5대 4고 저도 5대 4라고 생각했는데 만장일치로 이겼다고 해서 믿기지 않을 정도로 너무 놀라웠어요.
심판 9명의 만장일치를 이끌어낸 우승팀. 심판들은 어떤 점에 주목한 걸까요?
보통 판단 기준이 정책을 세웠을 때 그것이 가지고 있는 영향과 결과적으로 이게 무슨 결과를 가져오냐는 건데, 한쪽이 조금 더 좋은 결과와 조금 더 세분화된 정책 내용을 가지고 와서 둘 다 물론 좋은 정책이었지만 한쪽이 더 좋은 정책을 가져왔다고 판단했습니다.
네, 그렇습니다. 영어 실력도 중요하지만 논리가 더 중요하다는 건데요. 구체적인 논리를 펴기 위해선 상대방의 입장에서 생각할 수 있는 공감 능력을 키우는 것이 큰 도움이 된다네요. 아니, 토론에서 보이던 카리스마는 다 어디로 가고 대회가 끝나자마자 엄마에게 달려가 울음을 터뜨리는 모습이 아직은 영락없는 아이가 많네요. 감격에 겨운 우승팀 가족들도 눈물을 흘리고 준우승팀도 아쉬움의 눈물을 흘리네요. 오늘을 위해 지난 1년간 노력했다는 민영 학생의 서운함이 유독 커 보입니다.
저희는 나름 최선을 다했다고 생각을 했는데 판단이 지금 유나님이었으면 다 저쪽이 이겼다는 거에 찬성을 한 거니까 우선 그 점이 제일 아쉽고, 그다음에 다음 년에 또 기대를 해봐야죠.
그래요. 오늘이 전부가 아니라는 것을 꼭 기억했으면 좋겠네요. 1박 2일의 고된 대회 일정을 마치고 마지막 기념 사진을 찍으러 모인 수상자들. 어느새 힘들었던 기억은 싹 씻기고 민영 학생도 친구의 위로에 금세 미소를 되찾습니다. 오늘의 뜨거웠던 노력들이 미래 글로벌 리더가 될 아이들의 앞길에 비단길이 되었으면 좋겠네요.
현창, 신고미, 김재현 학생 오늘 스튜디오에 나와 있습니다. 안녕하세요.